All right, today we're going to talk about how these three realities of masculinity, faith, and trauma can cause problems for one another, and how we can kind of diagnose and get our arms around understanding why they can conflict so often. There's no glamour in being a traumatized male Christian. No social media movement decrying the horrors that men have faced in combat, or the horrors that adult men who have suffered boyhood sexual abuse face. You don't get social status points for being a male survivor. Under the surface, men who've experienced trauma, they wrestle with these complex realities with no guidance other than, well, just deal with it. And then it only gets more complicated when faith enters the picture, because faith communities manufacture arbitrary timelines by which your so-called healing must comply, even if you get to the place where you acknowledge that there's something that you need to survive. And even if you don't, there are certain behaviors which cut against the grain of traumatic symptomatology. You'll often hear lines like, "What's wrong with you?" Likewise, trauma therapists are usually antagonistic towards faith, usually. Faith is considered antithetical to a sense of personal agency and dignity. So meanwhile, neither community, the therapeutic community or the ecclesiastical community, neither of these communities really take seriously the horrific questions that can arise about God's relationship to trauma. Why did God not prevent this evil? Or the awkward relationship God has to death. Why does God allow good people to suffer and die early, before their time? Neither of these communities take seriously the odd relationship that can produce resentment between God and trauma. Is God punishing me for my lack of faith? Trauma and faith inevitably expose these realities and compel us to ask these questions. Where God stands over the wound site, there are questions that must be answered, that a thinking person will ask. Masculinity, faith, and trauma. These are the three realities, the three elements at play in the traumatized male experience that we have to get our arms around if we're going to understand the volatility that occurs at the epicenter of this identity. These three realities cannibalize one another. So, for example, facing your trauma can feel like kind of a chick thing to do. And so does talking about your masculinity while we're at it. Christian pastors, on the other hand, they usually have nothing to offer these sorts of conversations but blank stares and Bible verses. And honestly, most Christian pastors are fairly effeminate, whether or not that's worth noting. So the traumatized male Christian is in an odd place, because to be a typical male is considered hyper-aggressive by Christian culture and sort of counterproductive by trauma therapists. To be a genuine Christian can easily manifest itself as weird restrictions on masculinity and unrealistic expectations for when and how you ought to heal from trauma, what your behavior ought to look like, what story you ought to tell about yourself and your experience. And they come into conflict in other ways too. Like singing 80s sounding love songs to Jesus doesn't necessarily bring all the boys to the yard. I mean, also, masculine scrutiny can become fixed upon the problem of God and evil relative to trauma, which doesn't necessarily produce or facilitate, the social well-being of your small group. On the other hand, too, the behavioral effects of trauma are fundamentally unacceptable and incompatible with Christian culture, like alcoholism and pornography addiction and rage and anger and shame and secrecy. So men who experience these things are often left to 1, leave the church, 2, remain in secrecy, or 3, remain in public judgment. And then the last point we can make is basically this, that to be traumatized is to be considered faithless by Christians and effeminate by men for the reasons that we just listed above. So here's the problem, right? Masculinity, faith, and trauma require one another for the sake of recovery and growth, but they instinctively cannibalize one another without a strategy to integrate them. Avoidance is far easier than strategic engagement. So we're not going to outline a strategy for recovery, but here in this short time that we have, we're going to outline what ought to be recovered about masculinity and faith and trauma, and why their recovery can be so difficult. How can we make sense of these realities? What is the relationship between the abstract ideas and our very embodied experience of them? So we'll just start with the first one, masculinity. What is masculinity? Masculinity is ownership. Masculinity is taking ownership for the advancement of one's own maturity. As I've defined it elsewhere, masculinity is a man's maximization of his potential for competence. And if you outsource all of your moral responsibility for your own physical and intellectual and emotional and social maturity, then you will resemble a child at the level of personal competence. You will also remain weaker in strength relative to men who do advance their own maturity, and therefore, by analogy, resemble the so-called weaker sex, so to speak. So a man differentiates himself from women and children by becoming competent for their betterment, competent in physical skill, competent in self-defense, competent in work, in labor, in provision, in protection, in emotional maturity, and sensitivity, and self-care. Taking ownership for the advancement of one's own maturity, we should note, can also be a feminine quality. But the lack of taking appropriate ownership is distinctively unmasculine. Now, a man maximally fulfills his potential by working hard, prudently asking friends for help, strategically deciding how to advance his maturity in a way that yields the greatest degree of personal autonomy. The masculine autonomy that we're talking about evolves in its moral responsibility as the man physically ages, right? Bearing too much moral responsibility too soon, such as a boy providing emotional care for a codependent parent, right? This is intuitively unfitting. And so also as a grown man who refuses to take responsibility to advance his own maturity. There's sort of the inverse relationships of an unfitting relationship between physical maturity and emotional maturity. And masculinity can compel us to strive for a kind of control that both faith and trauma judge as impossible. The drive to secure is a good drive. It's what gives men the instinct to protect and to provide. But both faith and trauma can require a man to relinquish a degree of control in a way that kicks against these instincts of competence, forcing traumatized men to choose between advancing their maturity and facing their trauma in a Christian culturally accepted way. And the truth is more circuitous. It is a path that is not as straightforward. Doubling down on masculinity can make us ignore post-traumatic emotions because of their effeminate packaging, right? Even the words like emotions, it can make us feel weaker, passive, effeminate. The submission therapists require emotionally, and the submission that churches require culturally can emasculate the inquiring trauma survivor. When the words like man and believer and survivor become violently clashing identities, then a man is forced to choose between being a man and facing God honestly and addressing his trauma all at once, which he unfortunately must do. And it can feel as if one must reconcile all three at once or none at all. That is the way in which masculinity can become a foil for faith and for trauma. Now moving on to the way in which faith can become a foil. So if masculinity is a man's taking ownership for his own maturation or maximizing his potential for competence, well then faith is a relationship. It's a relationship to God. So famously, John Calvin spoke about faith in three senses: knowledge, which is like theological ideas about God, which he called notitia, assent, which is believing the truthfulness about those ideas, assensus, and trust, which is confidence in God's goodwill toward you in Christ, fiducia. Conscious faith is elastic enough to be an act of knowledge and belief and trust, or any combination of those simultaneously. A more simple way to put it is this: faith is any conscious relation to God by a human. But churches have culturally capitalized on faith by insisting on its own necessity for everything. So churches become a culture that insists on mediating the relationship with God through quote-unquote membership, which is enforced by both formal and informal compliance metrics. And because of this, one's experience of God and church have become necessarily tangled up in a way that's not conducive to the health of either. Faith can threaten masculinity in several ways. First, competent trust is meritocratic. I will trust people who have earned that trust, which is essential for recovery from trauma and for masculinity. Blind trust, which feels a lot like what the church and at least what the church says God is asking for. Blind trust resembles a childish and incompetent way of knowing, which would be very incompetent for a male adult and therefore unmasculine. Faith in God can feel very much like this incompetent way of knowing. Second, most churches in which men can exercise faith can feel culturally effeminate. They informally require a particular brand of orderliness and formality and disdain for fleshly passions. It feels like a system created to emasculate men. And their preferred style of faith often conflicts with fundamental good realities of masculinity, like drive and aggression and ambition. And any sign of these male-type traits are discouraged and rebuked and stomped out, often confusing aggression for arrogance and rewarding effeminacy with authority. Now, third, and this is sort of an informal point, most Christian pastors act and look like reprogrammed psychotherapists from the 1990s. Okay? A high portion of religious leaders appear physically weak, making it initially, I think, difficult for disciplined men to respect them. So you've essentially placed an effeminate male in the alpha position in a certain society, and that's going to set a cap for you in terms of the level of maturity in the men that you attract. Okay? The jobs of pastors essentially hinge upon the appearance of moral perfection, which also makes it difficult for men to trust them in a friendly capacity. So if you have a culture which is evangelical culture, in which men must always be on guard or facing exile around Christian leaders, careful not to exhibit traits which disrupt the dominance hierarchy of the particular Christian community, at the top of which is often a male who would not garner respect in any other situation, then you're setting your culture up for failure. You're setting your community up for failure for men. So that's a way in which faith can become a foil to masculinity and to trauma. Now, moving on to the way in which trauma can become a foil for masculinity and for faith. So psychological trauma, if masculinity is taking ownership of one's own maturation and faith is any man's conscious engagement with God, trauma is a wound. That's actually where the word comes from. Trauma is really a metaphor. So psychological trauma is a mental wound, okay? Trauma comes from the Greek word trauma, which refers to a physical wound, but it's applied in the psychological context to the effects of overwhelming suffering on the psyche. So trauma can mitigate against faith and against masculinity in several ways. First, there is the obvious problem of whether God made the evil happen of the trauma, right? Or at the very least, why he did not intervene. This is the problem of evil. If we take examples of horrendous evil, like child sexual abuse, the terrorist mutilation of soldiers, or something common such as, like the untimely death of a loved one, It's hard to imagine a morally praiseworthy human being, like a good person, who would not prevent such heinous evils if he could. If a human were able to prevent, for example, the sexual abuse of a child, but chose not to, we would highly doubt that person's moral fabric. The same legitimate moral intuition can evoke in us a distrust toward God. Why didn't he stop the trauma? Why didn't he prevent the evil? He's omnipotent. He's all-powerful. What happened? Why? Could there be a sufficient moral reason for allowing such heinous evil? And if so, why wasn't I consulted? That intuition can operationalize an aggressive attitude toward God, can incite in us an instinctive distrust toward God, pitting against one another are what Calvin calls our assensus and our notitia, or our assensus and our fiducia, our assent and our trust. Okay, so that's the first way that faith can become a foil, or trauma, rather, can become a foil to faith and to masculinity, the problem of evil. Second, trauma forces survivors to face the undeniable fact that they are not in control of everything. They cannot prevent every evil from occurring to themselves, their friends, and their families. More to the point, there's no degree of masculine advancement of maturity which can utterly negate the fact that the man was taken advantage of. Whether he was sexually abused as a child or physically attacked as an adult, there is, rooted in the consciousness of the traumatized male, an acute awareness, perhaps more even than many other men, an awareness of the concrete possibility which all men fear, that he is a bitch. And he can easily develop habits of behavior which he intends to overcompensate for this secret that he believes about himself, that he is a bitch, which he desperately hopes no other man will suspect. The third way in which trauma can become a foil for faith and masculinity is that trauma therapists are trained by mental health professionals who see themselves as medical practitioners. And these trauma therapists essentially claim the domain of trauma as their expertise, as their realm of authority. Even though their tool belt of competencies doesn't really extend to all of the realities which trauma can disrupt, faith and masculinity in particular. Yeah, you might be a great trauma therapist, you might be a really good psychologist, but what do you know about faith? What do you know about masculinity? Because that's what I'm wrestling with. So if you can deal with a third of what I'm going through, does that really make you the professional suited for my situation? I don't know. So facing trauma, whether it was from boyhood sexual abuse or military combat or something else, can again plant a sense of intimate betrayal at the heart of faith, right? Why did God let this happen? Or why did he decide for it to happen? And therapists are neither inclined nor equipped to engage this question deeply, nor the dozens of other questions that require deep philosophical reflection about death and family and manhood and fatherhood and male intimacy and dominance or virtue or the existence of the soul. Are therapists experts in those things? No. Most men find more therapeutic aid in the company of other men who are willing to be vulnerable and masculine with them than the so-called trauma-informed professionals who have been licensed to help them. Now, we don't need to initially here make moral judgments about all of these things, okay? But what we can do is we can begin to see these three realities and how they can disrupt one another. What it means for a man to face himself as a man, to face God, and to face his trauma. Each of these realities exists before us, whether we like it or not. And we will either suppress them, in which case they will manifest themselves in unconscious ways in our thoughts and our behaviors, in our relationships, or we will own them and advance our own maturity with respect to them. So while masculinity and faith and trauma remain actively operational realities inside our psychology and outside in our circumstances, we retain behavioral habits that function as sentinels to protect us from facing them because we don't want to face them. We don't want to slay the dragon. We don't want to face the monster. All of these things feel bigger than us, especially as abstractions: masculinity, God, trauma. We call these habits of ignoring these realities resistance mechanisms. Resistance mechanisms are excuses that we use to ignore these realities, such as duties of life and lack of energy and lack of a therapist and lack of money and indulgence in food and porn or obsession with an arbitrary hobby or a project. We use all these things, these resistance mechanisms, not to engage the realities which disrupt us at the most fundamental level. We dutifully enact these rituals of avoidance for our own sake, and we resist these three realities for a few reasons, I think. And these are the reasons that I think we resist them. Number one, we resist facing our masculinity and faith and trauma because we lack a strong purpose for facing what feels too painful and effeminate and embarrassing. If our choice is between a drunken Pornhub binge and an ambiguous sense of long-term personal growth, there's a clear winning every time. It's the binge. It's easy to think that the problem of avoiding these realities is solved by facing them, but it's not. Okay, there's a reason that they're difficult to face, and one of those is that it doesn't offer an immediate resolution or payoff. It's a long journey. And like any hard thing, we must have a sense of purpose in facing them over the long term, or we'll fail. So what it means to be a man, or to face God as a man, or to face God as a man who has personally experienced heinous evil, are too deep simply to resolve in a session or a day or a thought. They are philosophical facts of our existence, which we have been forced by circumstance to engage. These raise issues of self-honesty that may require us to be painfully critical of our current life choices. It might require us to face realities that we hate about ourselves, or hate about Christianity, or the church, or God. And that requires more from us than most therapists or pastors are equipped to supply. We actually have to dig deep within and supply what we don't have for ourselves. That takes a purpose, and a purpose is hard to find. The frightening fact of our situation is that we rightly sense how truly alone we are and how utterly incompetent we are at being alone. But there is a real path out of that incompetence, and it's found in our impulses to doubt, to question, to win, to overcome. It is found in our own masculine compulsion to take ownership for advancing our own maturity. Another reason that we resist these realities, our masculinity, our faith, and our trauma, is because they each require competing paths for their resolution. So once we decide to face these realities, we must be critical about them. What are they? And what's the best way of being them? We must begin with the fact that we have likely already chosen one reality over the other two. Our manhood over our faith and our trauma, for example, or our faith over our manhood and our trauma. Or we've chosen to engage with our trauma and identify with it at the expense of our manhood, the expense of our faith. Do we tend to, in our identity, to act as a man, or as a believer, or as a survivor? They all contain certain truths about one's identity that impel different instincts, right? The man taps into his aggression. The believer taps into his agreeableness. The survivor taps into his self-care. It's almost impossible to begin facing all of these three things at the same time because each of their trajectories of recovery mitigate against one another. A third reason that we resist facing these things is that the words and strategies and end goals for facing each one are not obvious. How do they actually affect one another? What's the unified end goal to which they all contribute in their fullest and best forms? What exactly can we get out of our trauma or our faith or our masculinity? And what are those things? And how do we need to understand and utilize them? And where can they help us get practically? What can they help us to overcome? And how? And are they really the best avenues for overcoming these things? So here are a few examples. Here are a few examples of end goals and strategies that we can utilize, right? You could say this: I want to be able to regulate my unwanted emotions, to make decisions based on reason rather than those unwanted emotions. That's one that you could make, one goal. Here's another goal. I want to live my life fully conscious, with the ability to shape my life through taking action without being inhibited by my past. Here's another goal. I want to be able to choose not to drink the alcohol if I know I shouldn't drink the alcohol. Here's another goal. I want to be able to make choices that are hard when they feel impossible in the moment. And you know what single goal all of these goals represent? I want autonomy. I want to be a self-governing individual. I don't want to be ruled by my passions. I don't want to be ruled by my circumstances. I don't want to be ruled by my past. I don't want to be ruled by the perception of others. I don't want to be ruled by a system of assimilation. I want to choose for myself based on principles that I find valuable. That's the end goal. Because in that principle, in that freedom, there is discipline, and there is meaning, and there is liberty and autonomy. So that's one end goal you could choose, manifested in some of those concrete ways relative to alcohol or difficult decisions or relationships. You come up with your own, right? And how do you accomplish goals like that when they are to some degree tangled up with an entire archaeology of habits and behaviors and feelings and patterns that, that have your trauma imprinted on them everywhere? Do you have to resolve the trauma before you can acquire a sense of moral power and agency? Do you have to fix your doubts about God and legitimate misgivings about Christianity in order to be a good person? You have to decide that for yourself. And here's a sort of a fourth and final reason that we often resist facing these realities, is that we perceive most other people as too careless or ignorant to helpfully engage these realities. So most therapists and pastors, in my experience, in the experience of many people I know, most therapists and pastors are jackwagons who have a fetish for being at the top of a social dominance hierarchy and get off on telling other people what they need to do. They usually think that these issues of masculinity, faith, and trauma can be solved in a single strategy or in a single modality, which is going to sessions for 10 years or 5 years or a year. And in the same way, non-professionals, like a lot of friends, they either won't know what to say or won't understand what a traumatized man is going through. So how can we relate to these realities? Because how we relate to them shapes how we relate to other realities. How a man chooses to face himself as a man, how he chooses to face God, and how he chooses to face his own trauma will refract into every single area of his life. The reluctance to act, the reluctance to engage these realities is itself a choice, and likely one of suppression. The route forward is not clear based on any of the things we talked about so far. But the hope in outlining these issues is that by coming to terms with each of these realities, we at the very least activate our existential GPS relative to these three realities. We triangulate ourselves by looking up, okay, where am I at with my masculinity? Where am I at with my trauma? Where am I at with my faith? And in asking those questions, sometimes we have triangulated our own identity. All of a sudden, ourselves becomes a blip on the radar. And no plan and no strategy or tactic or therapist or pastor will be able to help engage any of these realities meaningfully without a sense of where you are starting. And what we've talked about here simply supplies a few categories for diagnosing why it is that we keep getting lost as traumatized male Christians.